I'm going to take you through a little bit of background information for a proposal that you might have heard about in the news recently to develop a commercial seal hunt on the Pacific coast by First Nations people. I was approached about 2 months ago by this group of characters called the Pacific Balance Pinnipeds Society, which is a bunch of mostly First Nations commercial fishermen and one or two white commercial fishermen who seriously want to get rid of seals, or as many seals as they can get away with. So I wrote a proposal for them, did a lot of data analysis, which we were doing already anyway as part of the Pacific Salmon Foundation's Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project. And I'll show you a bunch of those data. It's a pretty scary story. The basic aims in this proposal are to reestablish a First Nations harvesting of seals and sea lions on the coast. Midden data from all along the Pacific coast show that seals and sea lions have pretty much always been a significant part of the diet of First Nations people, and were until the mid-1880s when the last smallpox outbreak devastated the First Nations population. And then the other actually hidden agenda behind this thing is mostly what these fishermen are interested in isn't making money from seals. What they're really interested in is increasing survival rates of Chinook and coho salmon, which we believe will happen, and I'll show you why. First thing, there's a, well, I guess I probably don't need to go through this. In this proposal, we had to evaluate sustainable harvest of pinnipeds using standard stock assessment method. We had to look at how much salmon abundance increase would occur if seal populations were reduced, particularly around the Georgia Strait area. We needed to evaluate ecosystem impacts on things like transient killer whales that feed on seals and sea lions. The impacts on tourism. We also had to demonstrate that the fishery might be economically viable, if they'll be able to sell these meat from these things to the Chinese and mink farmers or somebody like that in the hides. And it turns out that our seals have oil has one of the highest 3 omega fatty acid contents of any oil on Earth, so they can be sold actually as pharmaceutical grade oils. And then we also had to develop a regulatory approach involving quota management systems and so on. One of the most important parts of this story is that we did a reconstruction of what's happened to seal populations along the coast. And we have very precise data from aerial surveys on how seal populations build up after they were protected starting in 1970. The seal population along the coast has increased by a factor of about 10, and the sea lion population by a factor of about 3. We've also been able to use commercial harvest statistics to do what's called a stock reduction analysis, to back calculate how many seals were around back to about 1880. And what we find with that back calculation is that seal populations at that time, at about the time of the smallpox outbreaks, were about half of what they are today. Which means that until the First Nations populations were decimated, they were probably harvesting seals and sea lions at pretty close to the maximum sustainable yield levels. They had reduced the population to about half of its unharvested level, and at that level, the population would produce the largest annual surplus available for harvesting. One interesting thing here is that when we look at the very long-term catches of Chinook and coho salmon, the main species that we're worried about seal impacts on, those catches were stable through most of this period, and they dropped catastrophically in the late 1990s. That drop was primarily not due to overfishing. It was done to protect threatened populations of coho salmon and sockeye salmon. So this is a biodiversity regulatory approach that's occurred since the late 1990s. An interesting thing here is that the Chinook and coho catches did not build up until about 1920 or so, when the seal population had been reduced a lot through commercial harvesting and culling. And when we go back, this has surprised people, because when we go back into the really early, just population growth. When we go back into the really early catch statistics for British Columbia, we find that a very large commercial fishery had developed on the Fraser River and on the Skeena River by about the late 1800s or early 1900s. So there was a huge amount of fishing effort in the Fraser River system, but the people who did this reconstruction pointed out that there were hardly any chinook and coho being reported back in that period, even though there was enormous fishing effort for sockeye and pink salmon. So what we're thinking now is that during the early development of the British Columbia fishery, there actually weren't very many chinook and coho around. That high abundances of chinook and coho are a modern thing associated with reduction in pinniped populations. A particular focus of our work has been on the Georgia Strait sport fishery. I've been working on this fishery since the early 1970s. When I first started working on it, the Georgia Strait sport fishery was the most valuable single fishery in British Columbia. It was worth about twice as much as any other single fishery along the coast, and about twice as much as the Fraser River commercial salmon fisheries. But so it was enormously valuable. It employed literally thousands of people around the Georgia Strait in recreational fishing related activities, guiding and so on. So how many of you have been to Campbell River? Yeah, most of you have been there. Campbell River basically wouldn't be there, wouldn't have been there if it hadn't been for the sport fishery in those days. That was a major hotspot. You can see from these statistics that there was a catastrophic decline in that fishery began in the early 1980s. And we're currently catching less than a tenth as many fish as we were back then. This is not a regulated decline in catches. This is a decline associated with a huge drop in fishing effort in the fishery as the abundances have gone down. Exploitation rates actually remain quite high on coho salmon until the regulatory closure of the late 1990s. People are no longer allowed to keep coho salmon from the Georgia Strait. Escapements to the spawning streams around the Georgia Strait and Fraser have declined over that period, not quite as much as the catches. One interesting little piece of biology here is that the number of juvenile salmon of chinook and coho enter in the Georgia Strait each year over the last 40 years hasn't changed. So the same number of little fish are coming out of the streams every year as when I first started working on it in 1970. This means there's not been any overfishing. There are adequate numbers of spawners, even after the spawning decline, to fill the carrying capacities of the nursery streams around the Georgia Strait. So the decline in the fishery is not because of lack of juvenile fish. It's because of severe declines in the first-year marine survival rates. So we literally tag millions of chinook and coho salmon along the Pacific coast every year with little tiny coated wire tags that are recovered from those fish in harvest and when they come back to spawn. So we have not very precise, but we have substantially precise estimates of what's happened to survival rates over the first year in the ocean, and they've declined like that. So the proximate cause of the collapse of this fishery was not overfishing, it was not a lack of juvenile fish, it was a catastrophic decline in survival rates of those fish from the time they entered the ocean until they'd been in the ocean for 1 full year. That's another picture of the declines, just to show you how catastrophic they've been. In the 1970s for Chinook salmon, something like 3%, these numbers are bad back here, of the juveniles that entered the sea would reach sizes where they could be harvested. Now it's less than 0.3% of the fish, so it's a tenfold decline in their survival rates. When those survival rates first declined, people started to do research on them, me here, being ashore in Nanaimo, and our first thought was that the survival declines were being caused by competition between hatchery and wild fish, because we had hatchery programs massively increasing the number of juvenile fish entering the ocean. Well, I stopped increasing the hatchery production in the mid-1980s, and the survival rates just kept on going down, demonstrating that we'd been wrong about the effect of hatcheries. Beamish and others in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans turned to what you call bottom-up explanations for the survival decline. They tried to explain it as being caused by changes in ocean temperature. The ocean's gotten warmer over the last 40 years. And all manner of other oceanographic explanations. But the data we have on things like the abundance of plankton organisms don't show anything like that changes. Unfortunately, most of those data don't go that far enough for us to really be definitive about that. Then something really, if you want to see how confused we were, if you Google Carl Walter's YouTube, you'll see a video pop up of an interview done with me in 1998. I forgot who was doing the interview, and near the end of the interview they said, well, why do you think the coho salmon have disappeared? And I just looked at the camera and said, I don't have the foggiest idea why the survival rates have declined as much as they have. But then a dramatic thing happened. There's a character named Peter Alesiak from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans who'd been out flying aerial surveys of seals and sea lions along the coast since the early 70s. And Peter published his first pictures of what had happened to seals and sea lions. Well, those that looked at the pictures said, oh my God, because we could see this catastrophic exponential growth in populations of one of the most, potentially most severe predators of the juvenile fish. Then in 2012, the Pacific Salmon Foundation brought together about 60 scientists to do research in the Georgia Strait and Puget Sound and look at a wide variety of alternative hypotheses about what caused the survival decline. And mostly those analyses have just led to huge debate. But there's a group of us here at UBC who've been looking specifically at whether seals might be part of the problem. In 2015, Austin Thomas, many of you know him, you know the marine mammal group at UBC, published his thesis where he went and been out and collecting seal diet data from around the Georgia Strait and found that, gee, about 2% of their diet was juvenile chinooks and coho over the summer, first summer when the juveniles are out there. We thought, that's not very many fish. And then we said, wait a minute, hold on. We got 40,000 seals. They eat so many tons of fish. 2% of that is juvenile chinooks and coho. How many fish does that represent? And the answer was, it was about half of the coho smolts in the ocean get eaten directly by seals, turn up in seal stomachs, and about 1/3 of the chinook salmon are killed directly. Well, there's still controversy, and I'll go over the basis of that controversy. The controversy is no longer about whether seals are the proximate cause of the mortality. They most definitely are. The issue is not that, as we'll see. So what we see when we measure those survival rates, not as survival rates, but as what we call instantaneous ocean mortality rates. So an instantaneous rate is what happens when you convert a survival rate to a mortality rate in fisheries. So a mortality rate of 2 here. To get the survival rate, you go e to the minus the mortality rate, and that's e to the minus 2, which is 0.1. So these mortality rates of 4 and 5 are indicative. That's the same thing as me telling you that the survival rates were 0.03. Well, the best thing about using the mortality rates is that they're expected to be to vary linearly with the abundance of mortality risk factors like seals. Survival rates don't vary linearly, and you can't do statistical analysis directly on the survival rates. 2 main driving variables people have looked at, and they're correlated with one another. One is seal abundance, that's correlated with that pattern, and the other one is warming, an increase in surface water temperatures in the Georgia Strait. The first one is statistical relationships between the mortality rates that we see and the abundance of the predator that's taken them. The second one is estimation of daily mortality rates and then adding up over time using seal diet data. And then the third one is behavioral analysis of foraging behavior, how much volume of water they sweep as they're foraging. Okay. The statistical relationships are really striking. The seal abundance explains about 80% of the variation over the years in mortality rates of Chinook and coho in the first ocean year. This is a much better statistical correlation than with any other factor that has been measured over the long term. There's not much question. And statistically, if you just said, I'll believe whatever model fits the best, you'd say right away, seals are the problem. And seals are the cause of the mortality increase. And that increase is about 2 in instantaneous mortality, which means the survival is dropped by e to the minus 2 by about 90%. And when we compare correlations between mortality rate and seal abundance, we get higher R-squareds than we do with any other explanatory variable like temperature. When we take Austin Thomas's diet data and convert it, knowing roughly how many juvenile fish enter the ocean each year and how they're dying off, and take his daily consumption rates and convert them into daily mortality rates, we find that those daily mortality rates start out from large numbers of fish get killed really early on, right as they're entering the ocean, but the mortality rates are actually higher much later on. And the reason for that is that the mortality rate is the number consumed divided by the number at risk. So what happens is they keep consuming them over the summer, but out of a much, much reduced number of fish. So the mortality rates are actually higher later in the summer than they are when the juveniles first enter the ocean. And if you add up those mortality rates, daily rates, and add them up over the summer, they add up to about what we predict from the regression analysis. And then this third thing that we've done is to look at how fast seals swim through the water, how far they can detect prey away, so we get the volume of water that each seal sweeps per day. We look at the volume of water over which the juvenile fish are distributed, and we look at the proportion of time the seals spend foraging in that surface part of the water column, which is actually very, very low. And you put all that stuff together and add it up, and the predicted summer mortality rate, just based on how much volume of water the seals sweep and incidentally encounter juvenile salmon, is about what we predict from our regression analysis. So what this is telling us, I think, is that seals are not targeting juvenile salmon except a little bit at river mouths when the juveniles first come into the ocean. What the seals are doing is just swimming around looking for food in general, and when they see a baby salmon, they munch it because they're tasty little jaws with lots of fat and so on. So in a way, it's bad luck for the juvenile fish, and only bad luck that what we're looking at. When we look in more detail, we have a survey program out in the Georgia Strait that measures spatial distribution patterns of juvenile Chinooks and coho a couple of times each year, and that's been going on since the late 1990s. We also have counts of seals in each of the major haul-out locations where they haul out. So this map, every little number on this map is a number of seals counted at a haul-out site like Peter Olesiak or somebody like him. And we use individual-based models to predict how seals forage each day, how far they go, in which directions they go in, and what they do after they. What seals do when they go out to forage is they swim beeline out from a haul-out site to some choice of foraging location, and then they start diving and moving around that location for a while, and then they'll beeline back to the haul-out site. So we use a model like that to calculate the color intensity shown here, the relative predation risk faced by juvenile fish that happen to be swim around in each of these areas. And unfortunately, the high predation risk areas coincide pretty well with the high juvenile abundance areas. I think what that's saying is that whatever it is that seals are targeting out there, whatever kind of fish, they're targeting is correlated with whatever is attracting juvenile salmon. It's probably the food of both the juvenile salmon and the other fish that the seals are targeting that creates the concentration pattern. Although the seals are constrained because they have to have solid hole-out sites. So another piece of bad luck. Okay, now the issue that we're stuck with today is that the simple regression models just assume what's called mass action interaction rates. So there's a biomass or abundance of prey and an abundance of predators, and the rate of consumption of the prey by the predators is just proportional to how many prey there are and how many predators there are. Fair enough. That means the instantaneous mortality rate is just proportional to the number of predators. This is called the mass action or mixed system model. It's widely used in ecosystem modeling. You just sort of pretend that everything's all stirred together in a big reaction. That model is fundamentally wrong from the standpoint of behavioral ecology. We know that at any moment in time, if you go out there and look at juvenile fish out in the ocean, a fairly high proportion of those fish are going to be in places where predators can't get at them. They'll be hiding down in the dark, fair enough. Right? Juvenile fish have an enormous range of behaviors that they use to minimize predation risk. But part of the problem is if you're going to hide down there in the dark almost all of the time, sooner or later you've got to come out to eat. Fair enough. Sooner or later you've got to go forage. And that means that the juvenile move in what we call vulnerable behavioral state. You spend the minimum amount of time in there and then come back. We think mass action interaction rates apply to the animals that are vulnerable at any moment, but it's typically for only a short time each day and for a small portion of the animals. That can add up to high mortality rates. Fair enough? The problem, though, is that what if the vulnerability exchange process that makes juvenile fish vulnerable to attack is a stress agent? So we know these juveniles are subject to a variety of stressors. In particular, they are contracting diseases all the time. So one hypothesis is that the vulnerability exchange process is actually the rate at which they contract diseases. And when they contract diseases, they slow down, their behavior changes really dramatically, like juvenile will come to the surface and wallow around when they're heavily diseased. And they're going to get nuked by predators, they're going to be vulnerable to predators. So the mortality rate issue is not whether they become vulnerable due to that mechanism, but whether once they're in a vulnerable or stress state, whether it's because of disease or because of food shortage, or starvation or whatever, would they have died anyway? Fair enough? So people who don't want to see seals get shot say, oh yes, they would have died anyway. So the seals aren't adding anything to the mortality rates that would have occurred even if the seals were absent. Fair enough? Okay. And in fact, if we back calculate the vulnerability exchange rate, the rate at which animals apparently become vulnerable in order to get eaten in the numbers that they're eaten, we find that those apparent vulnerability rates have increased over time, just about in proportion to sea surface temperature. What kind of thing out there in nature behaves in a temperature-dependent way? Maybe you ever work around a fish hatchery where diseases are a huge problem? What do we know about disease in fish? Fish diseases are almost always strongly temperature-dependent in their expression. And relatively small changes in temperature can lead to large increases in the expression of disease organisms that the juvenile fish is carrying anyway. So it's an entirely viable hypothesis that that what we're seeing out there is not additive, classical additive predation mortality like we've assumed in simple models, but we're instead seeing the underlying effect of increasing vulnerability associated with other stress factors. So here we sit today. We got a large number of seals. We know they're actually the proximate agent of most of the increase in mortality. They are eating the fish that we know are disappearing in higher rates. That's no longer a big question. But we don't know if they would continue, if those fish would die anyway if the seals weren't there. Well, what's the right way for a scientist to react to that situation? Huh? Huh?
Harvest some seals.
Yeah, well, the only way to resolve the question is to reduce predator abundance and see if the mortality rates go down. There's literally no other way of resolving this uncertainty. Now, some people might say it's not worth knowing about, and so on like that, but a lot of us who value the fish that have disappeared would say, okay, this is an adaptive management experiment of serious, utmost importance to conduct and resolve the uncertainty once and for all. I'm going to stop just for a second here and see if you have any questions about what I've said so far. I'm actually going much faster than I expected to, so I'm almost done. So let's see if anybody has any questions about what I've said.
How do you calculate the historical seal abundances?
What happened was, starting in 1972, Peter Luciak started getting in a little Cessna 172, and he started flying the shorelines first of the Georgia Strait. And every time he saw seals on a haul-out, and you do this at the lowest tides when the haul-out rates are low. Well, actually, what he first did is he went out and he measured diurnal haul-out tides. There's a big variation diurnally in what proportion of animals are hauled out. He found out the highest proportion are hauled out at low tides. So he started flying this little Cessna along the coast, took pictures of each haul. Each time he saw seals on a haul, he'd take a picture of them. Took them back in the lab, and painstaking, we counted them.
But what about before those flights started? You have data for
No,
seals?
no. What we do for earlier years before that is we take the population growth pattern that the seals exhibited after harvesting stopped. And we use those population growth rates along with the harvests that were removed from them to back calculate how many seals had to have been there in order to produce those harvests. That was that first picture that I showed you with the line back calculating to the late 1800s. This is a pretty standard fisheries method for analysis of catch data for reconstruction of abundance. It's called stock reduction analysis. Fair enough. If anything, the SRA, the stock reduction analysis estimates of how many were around in the late 1800s were too high. There were probably actually fewer back then. The only way we could conclude that there were more, or to conclude that there were actually seals are back to anything like their natural abundances, whatever the hell that is, would be to assume much lower population growth rates in the early years than there is today. If anything, the old population growth rates were probably higher when there were more resources available to them. But the population growth rate that we observed in that data that I showed you from Alicia during the 70s and 80s has got to be very close to the Rmax for harbor seals. That's, you can't grow any faster than that, than they grew at that time. The birth rates wouldn't permit it, and birth and longevity rates for seals wouldn't permit any more rapid growth than that.
And the catch rates are from bones and middens, or?
Oh yeah, there's a really nice reference if you're interested. I can get you. There's a BC anthropologist that's summarized all of the data on occurrences of seals and sea lions and so on in middens in at least the south coast of British Columbia. There's an enormous amount of data. And bottom line is they ate them a lot. Probably, in fact, if you look at the older midden data, especially further from the north, salmon that are supposed to have been important to the Indians don't occur in most of those middens at all until about 2,000 years ago. When First Nations people first invaded North America, they were mammal hunters, very definitely mammal hunters. I did a calculation that each village that was around along the coast in 1860, before the last smallpox outbreak, probably killed about 20 seals a year. That's not very many seals. And seals are easy to get because all an Indian had to do to get a seal was to go find a haul-out site, hide behind the rocks for a couple of hours, and then club the seal. So seals are extremely vulnerable to harvesting because of the obligate haul-out behavior. Okay. Yeah, I guess I should have said all those things. An interesting thing about the midden data is that fur seals were really abundant in the middens going back. Stellar sea lions are not. And at least the first sea lion surveys were done back in about 1915, and then they did not show high abundances of stellar sea lions. Stellar sea lions have increased really dramatically. Since about 1983, they've been growing at about 6% per year along the coast.
Could you please explain to us why you don't agree with the food limitation hypothesis? Like, is there always been the same amount of plankton, or are those fluctuations only in this?
What food limitations?
You mentioned that the DFO concentrated on assessing shortage.
Decrease in food availability?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any evidence that food availability has actually decreased. Copepods have decreased. Fair enough, but they don't eat copepods. Right, so who cares? There's also no indication of any major long-term trend in primary productivity reconstructed from satellite information and from long-term circulation monitoring.
From a wild point of view, we stopped to catch pinnipeds in many parts of the world many years ago. Did you have any comparison with the similar situation that are going on between pinnipeds and I don't know, fish stocks somewhere in the world that could be useful?
There's lots of arguments about it. You got papers going back to a guy named Peter Yodzis who did a synthesis of stuff on pinniped predation, the issues in Venezuela, and whether or not they're out of control. The guy sitting next to you did one on the Baltic and concluded that it would not be any good to control seals, although there's a problem with the ecosim parameter settings that he used in his calculations. Eastern Canada, the paper just came out suggesting that one of the cod stocks in the Scotian Shelf, cod shelf, not Scotian Shelf, in the St. Lawrence cod stock has been doing this, and its natural mortality rate is going up like that. That's being caused by defensory predation by seals. On the East Coast, there is a commercial seal harvest and a continuing cull. There's no law in Canada about, like there is in the U.S. There's no Marine Mammal Protection Act like in the U.S. And quite large numbers of seals are harvested on the East Coast. The issue there is they aren't valuable enough to make it worth commercial fishermen going after them. They really like to see them kill a lot more than they do. So yeah, there's plenty of cases, and in every one of these cases, the same basic issue arises about whether they're dealing with additive predation, mortality, or not. An important one is that while none of the seals are listed under the Endangered Species Act, transient killer whales are. So I suppose most of you know that there's two kinds of killer whales. There's the we call resident type killer whales that are fish eaters, and the endangered one, the southern residents, seem to feed primarily on chinook salmon. Transient killer whales feed exclusively on marine mammals. About half of their diet is seals by number of prey, but in terms of weight of prey that they take, stellar sea lions are the most important diet item as a proportion of the mass of food that they consume. So there's some really cool data following transient killer whales around looking at their search patterns, how often they attack prey and so on like that. The basic bottom line is that the little tiny transient killer whales occur in little pods of like 3 to 5 individuals, whereas the resident type killer whales can be in much, much larger groups, have much more complex language. The way to think about this is transient killer whales are the nomads of the killer whale species. Fair enough. They move around huge distances. Pretty much all the transients move all the way back and forth between California and southeast Alaska every year. And individuals are resighted in all of these areas. And the proportion of them using the BC coast in particular, oh yeah, and when we do bioenergetics back calculations, it looks like they account for something like half of the total mortality of seals each year. So we can calculate how many seals had to have died, how many pups and older seals had to have died each year from the size of the population and the birth and death rates. And the transient killer whale consumption rates that we estimate from estimates of transient population size look like they account for over half of the mortality. So they're an important mortality issue for the seals. But if you look at estimates of transient killer whale abundance from marked recapture, from sighting, you see a transient, you take a picture of it, so you got an individual ID because they're all marked differently and so on, and notches and not notches. And then you do a marked recapture on those data. The transient killer whale population has increased, its use of BC waters has increased at almost exactly the same rate as the seal population. Right, well, a killer whale population cannot grow this fast. The demography of killer whales, the age at maturity and birth frequency and so on, says that they can grow about 3% per year. So what's happened over the years is that a radically increasing proportion of the coastline transient population is hanging around in BC waters, is using our waters. So we were asked by, as part of the development of this proposal, to develop scenarios for what would happen to that transient population if, or at least its use of BC waters, if seals were reduced. Well, if we used just this correlation between increasing use of the coast and increasing seal numbers, we would predict that the transient population using BC waters would drop by about 50%. The problem with that calculation is it ignores the fact that the dominant prey item by weight in their diet, stellar sea lions, has increased dramatically over recent years. And so if we actually go in and do what's called a type 2 functional or Hauling disk equation functional response analysis of what would happen to transient killer whale feeding rates if there were fewer seals available to them, the basic answer is they would have to spend a little bit more time searching in order to encounter each prey, but the prey that they encounter besides seals are almost all much bigger than they are. So when they kill a seal, the seal weighs about 50 kilos on average. That's about the daily food intake requirement of a transient killer whale, something in the order of 50 kilos. When they kill them, a big fat stellar sea lion weighs 300 to 500 kilos. That's 8 times as much. That's going to last them a fairly long time before they have to go out and kill something again. Fair enough. So when we incorporate that kind of calculation into what's likely to happen, the answer is that if, as harbor seal abundance were dropped, the number of harbor seals killed would drop off to almost nothing. But the total food intake would only drop about 5 to 10% because of the high availability of these larger prey items to the transient killer whales. That doesn't mean there would be a behavioral response, but we can at least argue that there's no sound basis for concluding that there's going to be some catastrophic decline in transient killer whales just because of knocking down the seal population, especially now that other large mammals are much more available than they used to be. Yeah.
What will the encounter rates be between the transient killer whales and the sea lions as opposed to the encounter rates between them and the seals?
Much lower. Much lower unless they focus their hunting activities where sea lions are. Stellar sea lions in the summertime they're almost all concentrated on about 3 major haul-out island areas at the north tip of Vancouver Island, south tip of the Charlottes, and then up in Dixon Entrance. So they're out there foraging on all kinds of things during the summer. Then in the winter, stellar sea lions move inside. They basically follow the herring as the herring migrate into the inside areas to spawn in the winter time. and they forage really heavily on them. And during the winter, they're widely distributed on haul-out sites in inside waters like the Georgia Strait and all along the coast. And at that time, they certainly would be vulnerable to attack by transient killer whales, no matter how the killer whales are behaving.
Can you
Another
explain?
thing is switching behavior. There's some really neat behavioral observations, as I said, about transient killer whale foraging patterns. One of Larry Bill's students in SFU worked on a lot. Who was that?
Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
We just have a few marine mammal questions. But one thing I was curious about, so the movement and diet composition data you spoke about was, I think, for harbor seals, right? And so Austin's work and Ben's work is diet composition for harbor seals.
Right.
And I'm wondering how sea lions factor in here. So sort of what proportion of a sea lion diet is juvenile salmon?
None.
None.
None. They're not here.
And they will be part of the problem.
No, they're not part of the problem. As I said, they're outside. They're outside in these foraging around these outside haul-out areas, outside the Georgia Strait and so on during the summer. By the time they come in the winter, and they're focused primarily on foraging on herring, they don't seem to take any substantial number of if they did, the feeding rates of stellar sea lions are so much higher than seals, they would have absolutely nuked all of the salmon populations of the coast. There wouldn't be any salmon. So a bit of behavioral ecology, we're lucky again. Yeah.
What other predator species of salmon have been kind of considered, other than seals?
One of the predators of salmon. People have looked really hard for that. They've opened up thousands of stomachs of hake and thousands of stomachs of dogfish and so on like that. The only other, and they don't find it. The only other, we know that for chinook salmon in particular, small, more than half the juveniles are not killed by seals. And we don't know what the mortality agents are that are killing them. Half of them never make it to the ocean, for one thing. Once they get in the ocean, there's still a really big loss of them, not due to seal predation, that we don't know what it is. Probably diffuse predation with rockfishes and a few other things like that. Bird predation used to be visible and obvious out there, but with one thing that's happened with increases in temperature is that juvenile chinooks and coho and juvenile herring have moved deeper in the water column out in the Georgia Strait. And we no longer see the big populations of birds foraging on juvenile fish at the surface that we used to in the 1970s. So that source of predation has gone down a lot.
Carl, just to follow up ahead, given the state of herring stocks, can you imagine a similar argument for stellar sea lion numbers, that they need to be brought down?
No, right now the Georgia Strait herring population is at a historic high. It's higher than probably any time during the 20th century. It's huge. And when we calculate how much the sea lions and seals eat during the winter months of the spawning period, it's about 5% of the giant herring biomass. There were big declines in herring biomass on outer coast populations, on the west coast of the island of Hawaii, that haven't yet been explained. They are coincident with the buildups and seals out in those areas, but those populations the fisheries on them were shut down over 20 years ago. And those populations are now starting to rebound rapidly.
Despite the sea lions.
Despite the sea lions, yeah. But it actually could be because the sea lions are all coming inside to eat the gigantic Georgia Strait herring stock, and they're ignoring the foraging opportunities in the outside waters. One scary thing about herring and seals is that there used to be all little tiny herring spawning stocks around the Georgia Strait. Places like up in the inlet here, in Broad Inlet, there were herring spawning in there. The west tip of Keats Island at the mouth of Howe Sound was a little spawning. And there's plenty of dotted on the own like that. Most of those went extinct during the 90s. when the big seal buildup occurred. And when we look at that, a lot of those spawning populations were only in the order of 100 tons or so of fish spawning in each of the areas. It would only take a small number of seals to move in and target those pre-spawning herring over a month or so that they hold before they spawn to just devastate it, to just eliminate them completely. And there it looks like some of the most interesting localized herring populations that had just distinct spawn times and so on actually have gone extinct. There's no sign of them recolonizing. Okay, let me finish up here. Bottom line here. This is something that there have been a couple of papers about this recently. If you look at pinniped consumption and commercial catch along the Pacific coast in British Columbia, okay, pinnipeds are eating about a little over 100,000 tons of herring. The fishery's taking about 14,000 tons. Hake, the fishery, seals and sea lions are taking about 100,000 tons, and the fishery about 25. And salmon, not quite such a big difference. The bottom line is that pinnipeds are consuming almost triple or double at least the biomass of fish that fisheries ever did, or at least do today. So DFO probably ought to be thinking about these populations as giant unregulated fisheries that have come along and built up in response to the availability of prey. And the question is, should they be monitored like we monitor the fisheries? We would never allow a fishery to take twice as many fish as all the other fisheries without at least monitoring its impact. And should they manage it as a fishery, as we would manage a fishery? And so what the Balanced Pinniped Society is saying, not just that we should be trying to restore this aboriginal state of affairs that probably characterizes the marine ecosystem off our coast for the last several thousand years at least, and a lot less seals. But we should be thinking about managing them the same way we would manage any other fishery on the coast that was basically out of control. So just because they're nice and furry and cute little things, does that mean they ought to be exempt from the kind of regulations we put on any fishery out there today to prevent overharvesting? And I say that especially because we're actually now starting to see not just localized herring extinctions, we're seeing localized extinctions of coho populations all along the coast, where those small populations at stream levels can be consumed completely by just a few seals targeting them at the stream levels. We're seeing serious biodiversity impacts from this giant fishery. And think about it. There you go. Yes, Catherine.
The Pinniped Society seems to be very aggressively after sea lion cull as opposed to a seal cull.
One of the directors was on TV throwing the palm.
Yeah.
Well, part of the reason for that is that these guys are all they're all purse seine fishermen, and they purse seine for herring at this time of year. And there's a new phenomenon. We have just been invaded by California sea lions in large numbers. 30 years ago, there weren't any California sea lions in British Columbia, and the most recent pseudo-censuses and DFO counts suggest that there's probably 20,000 of them. And those things fall on herring. So they're in there feeding on herring. And the problem that those fishermen are seeing is that if they make a purse seine set, like you saw in the TV footage where all those sea lions are sitting on top of the herring schools they just set around, and the herring can't get away because they're in the net, so that makes it even more attractive for the California sea lions to nuke them. There's actually a physical danger to the fishermen. If they try to purse the seine with those animals in it, it's a huge mass of animals. And it can actually, they claim, tip a purse seine vessel over. So they are actually concerned more about their own safety while they're fishing than they are about how many herring are being eaten by those sea lions.
Why can't the transient killer whales prey on the California sea lions?
Well, the historical data, diet data for transient killer whales is all since almost all 1970 to 2010, and most of that actually earlier than that. We didn't have any significant numbers of California sea lions, so our diet data don't show them in the diet.
That would surely
I
play
think,
into this whole
it should.
equation between their seal dependency and their sea lion dependency. And
Let me see. Yeah, California sea lions are a really small portion of the
but
diet
the question is why?
sample. Probably because there aren't many of them here.
You just said
Weren't
the
in the years when these, over which John Ford summarized these diet data, there weren't very many. Now, these diet data are primarily from direct encounter observations, right? There's a really dedicated bunch of people that follow transient killer whales around and actually look at each attack on the cam over time. It's really neat biology research.
It might be really
And
good to
so they
update that.
can tell which kind of prey it is that they're killing.
And that would play into this whole equation of seal consumption and not for the transient killer whales, right?
Well, it will change it.
So
Yeah,
that
if
would be-
California still increased.
So updating that would be important, it would seem, for the
Yeah, what it would
transient
mean is even less likelihood of any problem for transient killer whales if seals were reduced. The Pinnipeds Society's proposal about sea lions is not to reduce them, it's to stop their population growth. Right? And so it would mean trying to leave about the same abundance of them available to transients as there are today. We can't calculate population carrying capacities for Stiller sea lions. The population is growing exponentially. We can't say how high it's going to get. The California sea lions that we get here are all from the Farallon Islands breeding complex, right? They come up here during they move up the coast and move into our area in the fall, and forage here in the fall, and then go back to California to breed. That population is stabilizing. So there's reason to believe that unless they run out of food down south, we shouldn't see much more increase in their abundance here.
Except with water temperature shifts.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just curious about the sort of utility of the harvested animals to the First Nations. Are they going to be used for materials or for food or
Well,
for...
historically, they did two main things with them. They ate them and they made oolic and oil bags out of them. If you skin a seal carefully, you can plug up the holes and fill it with oolic and oil and cart it to Alberta and trade it for arrowheads and stuff like that. So there's the things called the grease trails that go up a couple of our rivers, like the Fraser, and go all the way back into Alberta, where they traded the oolic oil. It's incredibly valuable. But they did eat the meat. The commercial operation, the biggest uncertainty about whether it's viable is whether they can earn enough money from each animal to make it worth people giving up other uses of their time, First Nations people, just to go out and hunt for things. Because it is time-intensive hunting, actually. You can't just go out and fill a net full of them and so on. Well, they'd like to do that, but they can't do that with seals. It won't work. So economic viability of this fishery is a serious issue. Yeah, as it has been on the East Coast, whether they can make it work commercially. Yeah.
How seal hate smoke?
What?
How seal hate smoke?
Oh yeah, we produced a couple of ecosystem models back in the late 1990s. Some of you guys are involved in ecosystem modeling as part of your thesis should be warned about this. So these models have hundreds and hundreds of parameters in them for feeding rates and so on. And this model, it turned out if you knock the seal population way down, the hake population built up by about 50%. But that 50% increase in hake caused catastrophic declines in all salmon and herring and everything else in the ecosystem. And we thought, something's haywire here. I finally tracked it down, and it turned out that whoever was entering parameters in the EcoPath model put feeding rates for hake that were 5 times what they should have been. They had the hake feeding at consumption rate per biomass of 5 per year, way, way out of line. So if you fix that, that whole argument about needing to keep the seals in high abundance to keep the hake down disappears from those models. Also, it's a stupid argument in the first place. We've had low seal numbers for the 20th century because of intensive culling activity, and we didn't see all these ecosystem horrible things happen because of a lack of seals. We would have seen them certainly by 1960, and definitely after the seals were really reduced during the 60s. Yeah.
Why is it that the carrying capacity is seemingly so much higher now than it was historically?
It is not higher now than it was historically. They were kept down historically by First Nations harvesting.
Mm-hmm. But you were saying it's what, 20 or 30 seals per?
Yeah, that, at that population, if they were holding them at about 50,000, about half of the current population size. So if they were holding them, and First Nations people are always arguing that they harvest things optimally, well, that would be holding them at about 50,000. Then that would have meant a harvest each year of about 5,000 seals distributed over about 200 First Nations coastal communities, or about 20 per community. An interesting thing, it seems like not much, you know, you only kill 20 seals each year, but I worked it out. It's equivalent to 80 quarter, I hate to use this is horrible. It's about the equivalent to 80 quarter pounders per year. Now that's a significant part of your annual meat requirements, 80 quarter pounders. Yeah. Another thing you got to remember, the First Nations people, when it's cold out there, wet and rain and so on like that, you need high protein diets. You're not going to be a vegetarian out there. You're going to be a meat eater, and you're going to eat meat that has high fat content whenever you can. Yeah.
What is the economic value of the Chinook and local salmon fisheries, and what are the projected value after the culling of the seal?
The really big value is presumably in the recreational fishery. There's huge debate about how to calculate the net value to British Columbia of that fishery. If you just use an expenditure-based calculation, how much money people spend each day when they go out fishing and so on, you get this ridiculous number of about $600 million a year would be spent in the BC economy if the sport fishery were restored. The thing that's wrong with that number is that a high proportion of it is resident anglers, that if they weren't out there chasing salmon, they'd still be spending those dollars in British Columbia on other recreational activities. They go golf and sport fishing up in the interior or something like that. So the net economic value, if you just take the proportion of anglers that are coming to British Columbia from America and the rest of Canada specifically for sport fishing, and not just because BC is the most beautiful place on earth. Well, so you just net everything down to the people who say in questionnaires they're here to fish only. Then that 600 million drops down to about 20 million. Historically, and it's about 1 million now. So that 20 million would be about the value of the socket fishery, the average value of the socket fishery. Right, so you're talking about restoring at least the value of our most valuable commercial salmon fishery. And probably a lot higher than that. It's serious bucks, and it's serious numbers of jobs. And crazy things like the proposal that DFO has out now to shut down the sport fishery entirely in the Georgia Strait in order to save transient killer whales. It won't save them because the catches are so low now anyway, because the survivals are so low that taking away the catch that's there won't have any beneficial effect at all on Chinook salmon numbers. Right? But what it will do is take away several hundred jobs of people that now are sport fishing guides around the Georgia Strait for a high proportion of the year.
That guide industry must be many more millions that you talked about.
Oh yeah, the guiding industry was huge compared to what it is today.
It still is.
There was one lodge in Campbell River that had employed more guides fishing than all the Georgia Strait was today. Knew a lot of those youngsters. They were good people. There were good people out there today. What's really crazy is that they're going to be losing their livelihood for no bloody reason. It's just not going to do any good. You don't have to be a damn rocket scientist. You just look at the catch statistics to see that it's not going to do any good to take a catch that's this tiny and then reduce it to nothing. It's already trivial.
So Carl, there's a question here.
Oh yeah, is there favor for the adaptive management scenario based on the potential benefit for the southern residents and the whales? Like, does that enter the debate at all?
Well, it only has huge potential benefits for them, right?
Yeah.
And you're talking about serious increase in the abundance of Chinook salmon. The last meeting we had with DFO people, or the magic people, all dragging their feet, they had 2 people from the southern resident recovery team who were in the room. And I pointed out to them specifically that this was the way to generate a whole lot more Chinook for their southern residents than they could get from the fisheries. And there was no reaction from them. Because they already have their plan. They're going to change their ways and they're very good at fisheries. That's all they're going to do. They don't want to hear about anything new. They also don't want to hear about this incredible, if you haven't seen it, one of the most striking studies ever is a paper that just came out by Greg Regeroni, which has got to scare the hell out of anybody who works on southern resident killer whales. So Greg went back and taught it up for southern resident killer whales. We know the year of birth and the year of death of every animal population. Almost all the deaths since the late 1990s occurred in even years. And so 1998, 2000, 2005 deaths a year in each of those. 1 death in the odd years. Well, the only thing we know that has an oscillation like that's pink salmon. What's really scary is that this oscillating death pattern didn't appear until the pink salmon fishery was shut down. So while the pink salmon fishery was killing lots of pink salmon, the southern residents didn't show any regular mortality or pattern in mortality reverse. So this really smells like the problem has been created not by lack of Chinook salmon, but by some kind of weird interaction between southern resident killer whales and the big commercial fisheries that used to operate in the southern resident killer whales residence area. Spooky data. And no idea why this would happen. Why would they all die in the year when there aren't any pink salmon? This is not in the year when there are.
So Carl, so seals appear to be hammering coho and Chinook small. But why?
I'm not hammering them, they're encountering them incidentally.
Right, but it's a high enough rate to actually reduce the population. So pinks and other salmon species are actually doing really well. So
there's about 1 billion to 2 or 3 billion. There's 10 million coho and about 40 million Chinook. There's billions of pink chum and socket. And they leave the strait rapidly.
But shouldn't the encounter rate be proportionally higher too? If they're
No, because there's not for one thing. There's a whole bunch of reasons why seals don't seem to eat a lot of them. The main thing actually is just that they move through the strait very rapidly. So the time exposed to predation is quite low. Now we're working on what happens with returning adults, and we have now a serious suspicion that returning adult sockeye are seeing lower and lower survival rates in years of low abundance. We're seeing depensation. And there's a good possibility that depensation is being caused by stellar sea lions. The stellar sea lion main concentration is right on the migration route of the sockeye as they return to the Fraser.
So why do coho and Chinook juveniles hang around longer than, say, pink in the Georgia Strait? Anyone else?
They just evolved that life history. A very high proportion of coho, historically, a very high proportion of coho entering the Georgia Strait never left it. then beginning in the 1980s, we started to see some years when a very high proportion of animals left the strait. And that kind of erratic migratory behavior has been persistent ever since. Chinooks, for the stocks we're looking at, have a high resonance rate, and that's very stable over time. And that's just their life history.
And the pink salmon goes straight up to the other.
Well, not quite. There's some pinks actually hanging around, but sockeye and chums, pretty much all of them.
And sockeye also mostly goes straight up.
Yeah, it takes them about 20 days. Yeah, we got lots of acoustic tag tracking sockeye shows they move very rapidly on this stuff. We can't tag, we can't tag pinks and chums. I suspect we'll find that they move out pretty much the same way. They're moving out as fast as they can swim. When you're this big, you can't swim as fast as if you're this big.
So is it size selectivity too, to some extent?
Probably, well, the reaction distances to little tiny pinks, the distance away that a seal can detect them through sniffers or sight is much less than for most.
But I was thinking they would be much more vulnerable because they can't swim as fast. I was thinking more of the seals not going for small stuff because it's just not really working. You know what I mean?
It could be, they're just not bothering. But there are seals who do specialize in this, and there's a famous study that Andrew Treitz did where they discovered that seals were going up into Putnam River. There's a bridge where the Island Highway has all these lights shining on it. And these seals are laying on their back on the bottom of the river, snipping up these little tiny chum salmon smolts about this long, about 40 millimeters long. Who knows? If you can make it profitable, you do it. The diet data say, no, they don't touch the other species.
Carl, is there a sufficient monitoring of the survival rates, marine survival rates of Chinook and coho now, so that you would get the required detection of responses if you had an experiment? Or would they have to improve their Cote d'Ivoire tag study and so on?
There's an issue with estimating Cote d'Ivoire tag recoveries in the escapements. So with the coho fisheries shut down, we're missing a good part of the number of fish Cote d'Ivoire tags that do survive because the estimated numbers in the escapement are too low. But yeah, they should be able to detect it. So we're talking about a really large increase in survival.
So the monitoring is sufficient now to be able to keep
Yeah.
So maybe this would be a good time to